Welcome to the Book of Yugioh. My name is Josh, and in today's chapter, we're going to be ranking all of Yu-Gi-Oh's books. Yet not those books, though. Not those either. Okay, Getting Warmer is still not there. I mean, surely you guys know what I mean.
Be specific.
Okay, all right, you want specific? I will be specific. We are ranking the quote, book of, end quote, cards. We are ranking all of the book of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Landing at the bottom of the list in 5th place is Book of Life. Book of Life was released in July of 2003 as part of the original trio of books in Pharaonic Guardian. Its effect reads, target one zombie monster in your graveyard and one monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon the first target, also banish the second target. And this card is bad, but before we get to why exactly and why this card lands in last place, I want to talk about its design because, much like the owner of a successful coin-producing business, I like things that make sense. I'm sorry. Anyway, Book of Life is actually based on the real ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is a series of spells and incantations that were meant to help the dead find their way to the afterlife. It's fitting, then, that the oppositely named Book of Life does exactly the opposite in-game, helping a, quote, deceased monster return to life by coming from the graveyard to the field. Also, its second effect to banish a monster from the opponent's graveyard can be seen as a shout-out to the Book of the Dead that it's based on, as it's helping a, quote, dead monster find its way to Yu-Gi-Oh's best in-game equivalent to the afterlife at the time. So with that out of the way, what exactly is so bad about this card? What's keeping it so low on this list? Well, the biggest reason is its specificity, or its narrow scope of use. So going back to the effect, Book of Life can only be used to reborn zombies. And to have zombies to reborn with it, you have to be playing zombies. And as cool as zombies are, I like them just as much as the next guy, Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't necessarily have an extensive history of zombies always being at the top of the competitive landscape, and that's still true in the modern game, with zombie decks occasionally being a solid rogue pick or showing up as an engine in some more niche combo decks. Back in the day, you could make the argument that Book of Life is Monster Reborn with upside in the ability to banish an opponent's monster from the graveyard, but in the modern game, that theoretical upside is actually more of a hindrance. For years now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been heavily skewed towards the first turns of the game, and going first without a monster in the opponent's graveyard, Book of Life isn't even able to be activated, and nobody wants to have a dead card in their hand turn 1. It's also only one of 2 books that is not a quick play spell, so it can only be used on your turn, which limits its versatility quite a bit as well. So unfortunately for Book of Life, it doesn't have a huge history of competitive play, and isn't likely to see any use going forward in Yu-Gi-Oh! Either, so even though I do like the design of the card, I can't put it any higher than 5th place. 4th place, we have Book of Taiyo. Teo. Kayu, Taibo, I don't know. Book of Japanese Word, and this card was also part of the original trilogy released in Pharaonic Guardian in 2003, but unlike the other books, this card's name is a reverse translation, meaning this card is actually Book of Sun, with sun replaced with the Japanese word for sun, Taiyo. That's what I'll go with. And just quick rant here. I like Japanese. It's a very pretty language. I watch a ton of anime, so I hear it all the time, but does anybody know why they did this? Don't get me wrong, there are very iconic examples, Raigeki being one, where Konami just uses the Japanese word and it sounds awesome. I would much rather have Raigeki than whatever it's supposed to be, Thunderstorm. But this is just one card out of a series of 5 that they decided to take one word out of and reverse translate it as Taiyo, and the rest of it is in English. I just don't get it. It's just... Anyway, Book of Taiyo's effect reads, target one face-down monster on the field, change that target to face-up attack position. Historically, this card is famous for its use in the notorious Empty Jar deck, which still has its fans even today. Taiyo plays a key role in the deck through its interaction with Morphing Jar, the namesake and win condition of Empty Jar. Morphing Jar reads, flip, both players discard as many cards as possible from their hands, then each player draws 5 cards. And by getting repeated uses out of Morphing Jar along with other synergistic cards like Cyber Jar and Card of Destruction, Empty Jar aims to win by deck out, forcing the opponent to draw from an empty deck. Of course, monsters cannot change their battle position more than once per turn except by card effect, and Taiyo is that card effect, allowing you to flip a face-down Morphing Jar face up and trigger its effect again. So Taio is absolutely essential to the strategy, but outside of Empty Jar, this card has probably seen less play than even Book of Life, the one below it in the ranking. And that's mostly due to flip mechanic center decks, as cool as they are, being mostly a relic of the past outside of the occasional Subterror, or Shaddoll if you even want to count that, appearances in the competitive scene. Even going back to pre-synchro Yu-Gi-Oh, where flip effect monsters like Magician of Faith or Magical Merchant were heavily played, Taio mostly just serves to speed up the activation of those flip effects by one turn, as you simply wouldn't have to wait for your opponent to attack into your set monster. Theoretically, in that scenario, Taio helps play around common flip effect monster outs like Nobleman of Crossout, for example, but oftentimes it's just not worth it even back then, which is why it finds itself in 4th place on the ranking of books. The only reason I have it above Book of Life is it's not as specific, so it can be used on more than just zombie monsters, and Taio gains some points for being indispensable to an iconic or perhaps infamous Yu-Gi-Oh deck in Empty Jar. It's also the second of the books alongside Life to not be a quick play spell, limiting its versatility, but even if it was, it still likely sees next to 0 play in Yu-Gi-Oh outside of Empty Jar, so 4th place is as high as it's getting. And hopefully Book of Taio's placement at number 4 wasn't too jarring for you, but coming in 3rd place is actually the newest card of the book series, Book of Lunar Eclipse, and Lunar Eclipse was released in Lightning Overdrive in June 2021. Now, with respect to the Empty Jar fans and all 4 of the Book of Life truthers out there, there's a pretty big chasm between the previous 2 books and the next 3 on this list in terms of card quality, starting with this one. Book of Lunar Eclipse reads, discard 1 card, then target 2 face-up monsters on the field, change them to face-down defense position. This is a quick play spell indicated by the lightning bolt up here, so this can be used as a spell speed 2 effect on either player's turn. And if you've played a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh, which I have, you probably recognize this card's effect is pretty similar to Book of Moon. It's actually just Book of Moon twice, so logically Lunar Eclipse is twice as good, right? Well, not really. Let's break it down a bit though, starting with the good stuff. In general, regarding Yu-Gi-Oh card text, everything before the semicolon is cost, or the action or actions that must be taken to activate an effect, and everything after the semicolon is the effect. So the effect of Lunar Eclipse is to change them, meaning the 2 targeted face-up monsters, to face-down defense position. That's a pretty versatile disruptive effect, and just how versatile we'll get into later, but for example, if your opponent controls 1 tuner monster and 1 non-tuner monster, you can prevent them from synchro summoning by flipping one of those monsters face down. And in Lunar Eclipse's case, there's the additional upside of being able to flip an extra monster, either yours or another one of your opponent's. So while there are scenarios where Lunar Eclipse's effect can shine, even compared to the higher ranking books on this list, its cost is really what's keeping it in 3rd place. Firstly, the card states you must discard 1 card as the first action of the cost. There are decks where this can be advantageous, but largely this only serves to make the card more costly to use. And in terms of card advantage, Lunar Eclipse actually results in a negative interaction for the player using it. And to explain that a little bit, let's reference the previous scenario. Player A, the Lunar Eclipse user, loses Lunar Eclipse itself, as well as the discard paid as an activation cost, while the Sword Soul player still retains both targeted monsters, albeit flipped face down. Given player A lost 2 cards, and player B lost 0 cards, this results in a -2 interaction overall for player A. Secondly, Lunar Eclipse's other activation cost is to target 2 face-up monsters on the field, and this language specifies that exactly 2 monsters must be targeted as cost, meaning that if there are not 2 valid targets, Lunar Eclipse cannot be activated at all. This specificity limits the versatility of the card in terms of a disruption, as the more specific a card's activation conditions, the less situations there are in which the card can optimally be used or used at all. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on to the books ahead of this on the ranking, but overall Lunar Eclipse is a viable option to play in the modern game. It even appeared in the side decks of a couple tournament deck lists in 2023, and had it been released pre-2021, it likely would have had some historical play as well. That said though, the cost of this card is what really holds it back, as even when the card is able to be optimally used, a -2 interaction as a result is pretty costly, especially considering there are more efficient options out there, and maybe even more efficient options in this ranking. So even though Book of Lunar Eclipse is my personal favorite in terms of how it looks, its flaws don't allow it to be any higher than 3rd place on this list. And now only 1 book can be the best. So coming in second place is Book of Eclipse. Released in September of 2008 in the Duelist Genesis, Book of Eclipse is a combination of two of the original books, Taio and Moon, which can be seen not only in its artwork but also in its effect, which reads, change all face-up monsters on the field to face-down defense position. During the end phase of this turn, change as many face-down defense position monsters your opponent controls as possible to face-up defense position, then your opponent draws cards equal to the number of monsters changed face-up by this effect. So it flips monsters face down, like Book of Moon, and face up, like Book of Taio. This is a quick play spell, as we can see here, and there are a couple things that make this card pretty unique, even just within this book series of cards that we're ranking. The first is that there's no activation cost here, as we can see by the lack of a semicolon anywhere within the card text. And the second is that there's a second part to the effect that resolves at a later time. All of the other books have a cost associated with their activation, and they also do not contain any lingering effects like we have here. We'll come back to these, but for now, let's talk about why this card is so good and why it's deserving of a very respectable second place in this ranking. Comparing Book of Eclipse to Lunar Eclipse or Moon, Eclipse actually far surpasses both in terms of the sheer number of monsters it can affect at a time, as it can potentially flip down a total of 12 monsters with one activation. This makes it easily the most directly powerful of the books, and contrary to Lunar Eclipse resulting in a -2 interaction, Eclipse, if we disregard the second part of its effect for now, results in a much better -1 interaction, as the user only loses Eclipse itself after it resolves. To continue the comparison, Lunar Eclipse is dragged down in the ranking by its inferior versatility versus Book of Moon, but Eclipse doesn't suffer that same problem, at least to the same degree. As powerful as it can be, it can also be used to simply flip one monster face down like Moon and doesn't face any of the restrictions and activation that Lunar Eclipse or Life do. It's also the only book whose text does not contain the word target, and this is actually huge as it allows Eclipse to be a potential out to problematic monsters that cannot be targeted, cards like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, Cosmo Dark Destroyer, or Magispector Unicorn Kirin. So now we've established that Book of Eclipse is more powerful than Book of Moon, it outs cards that none of the other books can, and it's potentially more efficient than Book of Lunar Eclipse. So why second place? Well, because only two of those statements are actually true once we factor in the second part of Eclipse's effect. The part that reads, during the end phase of this turn, change as many face-down defense position monsters your opponent controls as possible to face-up defense position, then your opponent draws cards equal to the number of monsters changed face-up by this effect. So while Book of Eclipse's efficiency is static or remains the same for the user, as it's always a simple -1, its true measure of efficiency is actually conditional depending on the amount of draws it gives to the opponent. For example, referencing our previous Sword Soul scenario, if we substitute Lunar Eclipse for Eclipse, even though using Eclipse at this point is only a -1, during the end phase, the opponent will draw 2 cards for both the Moye and Longyeon that were flipped face down. That means in totality, Book of Eclipse actually resulted in a -3 interaction because the opponent gained 2 cards while the Eclipse user lost 1 card. So a total swing of 3 cards in favor of the opponent, which is worse than even the -2 from Lunar Eclipse. But where Eclipse really becomes an outstanding card is when paired with another that can remove those flipped monsters from the board. This is easiest to accomplish when going second and using Eclipse to help break an opponent's board. For example, Eclipse flips their monsters face down, and a card like Raigeki can follow up, destroying those monsters. Since those monsters have been removed from the board, they cannot be flipped face up during the end phase, and thus the opponent gains no draws from Eclipse's effect. If that card combination removes 2 monsters at least, it then becomes a neutral interaction in terms of card advantage. And any more than 2 monsters, and the Eclipse user will actually be plussing, which is fantastic. This is harder to accomplish when using Eclipse as a disruption on the opponent's turn, but can be done, and given that Eclipse can potentially flip a whole board of monsters face down, a well-timed activation can completely end a turn, which in the right situations can be worth the card advantage it gives to your opponent. One other thing hurting Book of Eclipse in this ranking, though, is the existence of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Since its release in 2017, Ash has been one of, if not the most played card in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and because Eclipse contains an effect that draws cards, it can be negated by Ash Blossom. And it just hit me as I said that, 2017, that means Ash has been out for 7 years now, which is way longer than I thought. It's got me feeling like Diane Keto, the Cure Master out here. Because because it makes me feel like I'm old and a woman. Anyway, overall, Book of Eclipse is a great card. It's powerful, it's versatile, and it can out monsters that many cards, including the other books here, can't. It's made its way not just into tournament side decks, but even main decks at a full 3 copies over the past year. It's comfortably in the category of a side deck staple and a card that every player should have on hand. But only one book can be the best, so coming in first place is unequivocally, undebatably the best book, Book of Moon. And if you're an avid Yu-Gi-Oh player, you knew this was going to be number 1 before you even clicked on the list. Of course it's Book of Moon, but let's talk about it anyway. Released alongside Life and Taio in 2003's Pharaonic Guardian, Book of Moon is the opposite of Taio in name and effect. Moon reads, target one face-up monster on the field, change that target to face-down defense position. So while Taio, or Sun, flips monsters face up, Moon flips them face down. The other big differentiator between the two is this symbol here, which of course tells us that this is a quick play spell. And this little symbol is responsible for turning Book of Moon from a card with only niche use to one of the absolute best cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And we know that because this card is also the only one of the books to spend time on the Forbidden/Limited list, and significant time at that. Book of Moon was limited in October of 2005, just 2 years after its release, and was moved to the semi-limited list in March of 2008 before coming off the list entirely the next year in March of 2009. And if you were playing at the time, you then got 2 full years of being able to play 3 copies of Book of Moon before it was limited again in March of 2011. The limited section is then where it remained until January of 2020, when Book of Moon was again released from the list and has remained free since then. That's a total of 13 years spent on the Forbidden/Limited list. So let's take a look now at why exactly this card is so good and deserving of the number 1 spot on the list. And it really all comes down to versatility, something we've brought up many times in the video already, and it's hard to get any more versatile than Book of Moon. This card has so many uses, both proactively, reactively, going first, and going second, that yes, I could literally write a book on it. And now I'm going to list every single possible use case that exists for Book of Moon. It can change flip effect monsters like Magician of Faith, Raiko Lightsworn Hunter, or most infamously Morphing Jar face down to reuse their effects. It can change a high attack monster to defense position to allow it to be more easily destroyed in battle. It can prevent an attack by flipping down an attacking monster, or block an attack by flipping an attack position high defense monster you control face down to make it more difficult to attack over. It can prevent cards like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, or Draco Berserker of the Tenny from resolving their effect to attack again after destroying a monster, possibly preventing a game-ending push. It can allow an attacking monster to dodge battle traps like Mirror Force or Dimensional Prison. It can reset any stat or level increases or decreases currently being applied to a monster. It can cause any equipped spells equipped to the targeted monster to be destroyed. It can prevent Synchro, XZ, Link, and even some ritual summons by flipping one of the materials face down. A shout out on my fusions though. It can stop an opponent from activating a monster's ignition effects by flipping a card like Kashtira Fenrir, for example, face down before it can activate its search effect. It can allow a summoned monster to dodge cards like Bottomless Trap Hole, or similar cards that require specific information like an attack stat to be known about the target, as a face-down monster has no known stats. It can allow a monster summoned by a card like Instant Fusion, or a monster affected by limiter removal, to dodge its designated destruction in the end phase and remain on the field. It can allow monsters to become vulnerable to removal cards for face-down monsters, like Nobleman of Crossout. It can allow monster effects to resolve through cards like Skill Drain or lose 1 turn by chaining it to the monster's effect. Since a card like Skill Drain negates the effect of the monster but not the activation, by the time the monster's effect would resolve, it is now face down and thus cannot be affected by Skill Drain. It can also allow monster effects to resolve through targeted negation like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, or similar cards that require the target to be face up to resolve. It can out monster-based floodgates like El Shaddai Winda's Special Summoning Restriction or Masked Hero Darklaw's Continuous Banishing effect. It can allow a player to escape an attribute or type lock from floodgates like Rivalry of Warlords or Gozen Match by flipping that monster face down, potentially freeing the player to summon a monster with a different attribute or type. It can cause monster effects containing a clause like, "This card must be face up on the field to activate and resolve this effect," to fizzle. A card like Naturia Barkion, for example. And lastly, this is niche, but it can prevent a card like Swift Scarecrow from ending the battle phase by flipping the attacking monster face down before Swift Scarecrow can negate the attack. Had to cut some of that out there for time, but rest assured, I was here for days recording all of those. Every single possible use case is right there, I promise. Anyway, Book of Moon has actually been so historically good that it earned a nickname, but not just any kind of standard nickname that's just a shortened version of the full card name like Ash or Imperm or Nib, a real nickname, an epithet, if you will. Book of Moon has long been called the best -1 in the game. We've talked card advantage a bit already in the video, so don't need to break this down too much other than to say that what that epithet really means is that although Book of Moon does result in a -1 interaction for the user, which is typically a bad thing, it more than makes up for it with its versatility and power, as this type of disruption can, at its height, completely end a turn if used optimally. Compared to the other books, Book of Moon is not as directly powerful as Eclipse or Lunar Eclipse in terms of how many cards it can affect. It's also less efficient than Book of Life in terms of the card advantage swing its use results in. However, in the realm of versatility, which is defined as the ability to adapt or be adapted to many different functions, Book of Moon is nearly unmatched. And fun fact, it's also one of my personal favorite cards ever. So Book of Moon really couldn't be anything but #1 here. And that's it. So what did you think about this video? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Would you negate it? Or does it resolve? Let me know down in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This is the Book of Yu-Gi-Oh! My name is Josh, and I'll catch ya in the next chapter.